Hello, this is the video about Where Are You Going, Where Have You Been? The short story by Joyce Carol Oates, and the other reading material that we had in that unit. You'll see in the background here a typical drive-in the late 50s, 1950s. One of the articles that you had to read mentions that she may have been talking about a Bob's Big Boy because it featured a revolving figure of a grinning boy holding a hamburger aloft. And that may be, but those were not well known except in California, western United States. And so she may have been referring to that, but this was a more typical drive-in at that time period. So I wish we could sit together and talk about this story. It's always interesting to see people's first reactions to it. My first reaction, I can remember when I first read this many years ago. I can remember the weather, where I was, and how chilled I felt after finishing the story. How easily he was able to manipulate Connie into just calmly walking out of the house. And it just really scared me. A lot of people seem to or want to blame Connie for ending up the way she did, and I want to caution you about that. It's kind of like blaming the victim. I don't think we want to really do that. No one should suffer what she is about to suffer in the story, no matter what they do. Even if she were stark naked in her own home or anywhere, no one should be accosted like that. One way you might start when looking at the stories is to look at the characters. And Connie, because she is a complex character, she is a child. She depends on her family, though she's trying to assert her independence, and that makes her more complicated. She's dynamic because she changes by the end of the story. She comes to some realizations about herself and her life. And Arnold Friend is a flat character. He enters the story the same way he exits the story. He is evil. He has one way of acting, and that's it. He doesn't change. He is manipulative evil. Look for literary devices such as motifs. The articles that I've given you talk about rock and roll as a religion, and then it has religious images as well in the story. You might also ask yourself if you know the original meaning of the word rock and roll. If you don't, go ahead and look it up. And then some people find symbolism in the story, in the character of Arnold Friend, that he represents the devil, and many of the descriptions of him are like those attributed to the devil in Christian religion. And if you see all of that, then ask yourself, what is the author's purpose in putting those in there? Why did she include those descriptions? Why did she include the references to rock and roll and religion? What is her comment on society and on humans and human behavior? Also ask yourself what literary critical theories you would use. I have given you also notes on how I read the story, my reactions, what critical theories I used. Formalism. If you used formalist critical theory, you would look at characterization, symbolism, and themes. Things like that. You could also look at setting. There are many things you could look at with formalism, but just to give you an example, if the things that stood out to you in the story were the characters or the symbols, then you would be doing formalist critiquing, whether you knew it or not. If you examined the effect on the reader, on you, the reader, and on readers in general, and what might cause them to be so frightened by this story, then you would be doing reader response. And if you looked at the motivation for Connie's actions, why did she agree to go with him? We can examine her psychological, her unconscious motivations for her behavior. And if you wanted to look at the Christian symbolism, the Christian motifs in the story, and Arnold Friend as possibly representing Satan, then you're doing archetypal criticism without even mentioning the word archetypal. And finally, if you wanted to look at role assignment for women, for all of the women in the story, Connie, her sister June, the mother, what can we say about how Joyce Carol Oates sees women, or how the characters in the story see women? So just to get you started on thinking in a focused way about the stories, I wanted you to look at this. In the article, A Source for Where Are You Going?, notice that he begins with a review of literature. And all articles do this. They present the topic, then they tell you what's been written about that topic. The topic is the short story. So what has been written about it in the past? And then he gives you his theme that he's going to examine, the death of the American dream. And he tells you that some of his sources are from Time magazine, Life magazine, and Newsweek. And it is that this story was based on the story of Charles Howard Schmid, a real person. So he's looking at the historical and sociological implications in this story. To compare Charles Schmid and Arnold Friend, here's what he presents to you that he got from the sources. That Charles Schmid was short, and he used material in his boots to look taller. He was older at 23 and hung around with teenagers. He wore makeup and dyed his hair black. Probably wore some makeup to cover acne scars or something like that, and hung around with teens, dyed his hair black. He may have been having some gray hair show up already. He drove an old car painted gold, just like Arnold Friend. He flashed money. He bragged about the women he had had. And the article, I think, gives you some pictures of Schmid, or at least the Time and Newsweek articles do, if you want to look them up. And the irony of his nickname was Angel. And so it is ironic that Joyce Carol Oates is giving Arnold Friend an angel name also, because an old fiend, if you take out the R's, an old fiend is the angel of light, which is Satan. Now this says 4:15:6. If that doesn't apply to the article I gave you, then ignore that. But just look at the comparison. So she has used this as a starting point for her article, for her short story, but it's not exactly the same. The crimes that Charles Schmid perpetrated were 3 murders. He had accomplices in John Saunders and Mary French, and they killed someone named Aline Rowe, and she is the equivalent of Connie. Arnold Friend knows stuff about Connie just as Charles Schmid knew things about Aline. And what was the girl's crime? That she was killed for a snub. That was it. Wasn't putting herself in danger, even if, you want to blame Connie for the crime. It's not her fault. She was just a girl in the wrong place at the wrong time. And rock and roll. This is a motif suggested in periodical articles. And if you look at the cultural attitudes to rock and roll back then, it was seen as the devil's music. And a lot of churches had people going out and burning records, albums, and saying it was Satan's work. And if you played them backwards, you'd hear Satan songs. But did you look up the meaning of rock and roll? It is the original meaning of rock and roll is intercourse. I don't know how else to say it, but that's it. So you hear all these songs back then, and that's why they thought, oh, the whole world is going to hell in a handbasket because we're singing about this in our songs. So this liking of rock and roll between Connie and Arnold became a psychological link, a link of rebellion, a link of this is something we share that nobody else knows, that we know what it means and nobody else knows what it means. And a lot of times as this moved on, people don't even know what rock and roll meant. By the 60s, they didn't know what it meant. A sarcastic quote from the Life article: "Isn't Tucson, out there in the Golden West, in the grand setting where the skies are not cloudy all day, supposed to be a flowering of the American dream?" What is the American dream? Well, the American dream embodies values such as home and hearth and innocence. And this story is innocence taken away. The place where you came from ain't there anymore, and where you had in mind to go is canceled out. And I think if you think about it just a little bit, this very much applies to where we are today in America. The place where you came from ain't there anymore. The place of innocence. We are no longer an innocent nation. Daily I read things of horrific crimes. The place where you had in mind to go is canceled out. Even it may not have even existed, but we think it did or thought it did. The question is directed at Connie and at America. Where are you going? Where have you been? Connie, where are you going? Where have you been? The time of innocence is gone for Connie as she walks out that door. The time of innocence, as Tom Quirk implies, is gone for America when we have people murdering for nothing more than a snub. Just looking at someone wrong. The time of innocence is gone.